history behind that because it's a fascinating story. And again, most Muslims don't know the history of their own book. But first, just a kind of a general introduction of the Quran. What is the Quran? What's this all about? What does this book mean to Muslims? Well, Muslims actually believe that the Quran is the literal, as the narrator said, the literal word of God, brought down to Muhammad by the angel Gabriel. Now, a little bit of background about Muhammad. Muhammad began meditating in a cave outside Mecca called Mount Hira about the year 610 AD. He thought all the religions of his time were false. He thought that Christianity was false, that Judaism was false, the scriptures that God had brought down to Christians and Jews somehow had become lost or corrupted. So he went to meditate in this cave outside Mecca, seeking to have God reveal to him the true religion. And one night he falls into a trance. And supposedly the angel Gabriel whispers parts of the Quran to him. The very first recitation that was given to Muhammad is recorded in Surah 96, chapter 96 of the Quran. And so begins Islam, so begins the Quran. Over a 23-year period, the angel Gabriel visits Muhammad over this 23 years time span, revealing to him at each visitation a little bit more of the Quran. So that's how we got the Quran. Now what is the Quran? Muslims believe that the Quran is an exact copy of God's revelation that is existing in heaven on eternally preserved tablets. They believe that every word that the Quran contains now is the same revelation that was given to Muhammad by the angel Gabriel, beginning in 610 AD, outside Mecca, hiding in that cave. Revealed over a 23-year period as the needs arose, and is free from human influence. Muslims believe that the Quran that they have today is exactly the same Quran that was given to Muhammad. Now that's a lie. We're going to expose that tonight. But they believe every word, every syllable, every punctuation mark that is in the Quran that Muslims possess today is the same Quran that was revealed to Muhammad bit by bit over this 23-year period, from 610 to 632. Now let me show you what Muslims actually believe about the Quran. This is what they're told. I'm going to put a couple quotes up here from some Islamic websites. Read this one. The Quran has not been expressed using any human's words. Its wording is letter for letter, fixed by no one but Allah. So this is God's message to mankind. And the Quran we have today is the exact word of God, letter by letter. That's it, IslamicWeb.com. Islamic website. Here's another one. The Quran is the record of the exact words revealed by God through the angel Gabriel to the Prophet Muhammad. It was memorized by Muhammad and then dictated to his companions and written down by scribes. Notice that. Written down by scribes who cross-checked it during his lifetime. We're going to dispute that. We're going to dispute that. Not one word of its 114 chapters or surahs has been changed over the centuries. We're going to dispute that too. So that in the Quran, in every detail, is the unique and miraculous text which was revealed to Muhammad 14 centuries ago. IslamicCity.com, an Islamic website. Here's a quotation from the Muslim Student Association at USC, University of Southern California. Allah guaranteed that He will protect the Quran from human tampering, and today's readers can find exact copies of it all over the world. The Quran of today is the same as the Quran revealed to Muhammad. No, it's not. And we're going to prove that. But this is what Muslims are told. This is the propaganda that they're given, because they're not told the history of their own text. If the imams of our mosques today were to tell their congregants the true history of their own text, they would lose their congregations. They don't want to do that. So, what's the story of the Quran all about? I'm going to try to narrate it for you in kind of a story form, but I'm going to, at various times, I'm going to quote some Islamic scholars in here as well, because it's a fascinating story. Here's the way the story went, and this is the part you need to understand. When Muhammad had these revelations, he would go into a trance. At each of these revelations, and there were hundreds of them that occurred over this 23-year span, during each of his revelations, he may have had around him 2 or 3 of his closest companions, his kind of inner circle of friends. At one particular revelation, he'd have 2 or 3 friends. At another revelation, he'd have 2 or 3 other friends, different people. At another episode, he may have 3 or 4 other friends, different from the other revelations. This is important to grasp, and you'll understand why in a moment. But just remember, every time Muhammad had a revelation, every time he received parts of the Quran, when the angel Gabriel told him what to say, he would recite it out. And what he would recite out was memorized or written down by the group of companions that were with him during that particular single episode. Okay? Hold on to that. We're going to come back to that. So what happened? Muhammad began receiving his revelations over a 23-year period. And Islam at that time was a very oral culture, had a very rich oral tradition. So when Muhammad received his revelations and the angel Gabriel told him what to recite, and that's what the Quran means. The Quran actually gets its name from the Arabic word for recite, recitation. Quran. The Quran. Muhammad would recite the recitation that was given him by the angel Gabriel, and his group of companions around him during that particular episode would try to memorize what they heard. And if they couldn't memorize everything, they would scramble for stuff to write it down on. They'd find a piece of animal skin, or they'd find a bone, maybe a shoulder bone or a scapula from a camel, or a rock that they could make an inscription on, or a piece of bark or something. They'd struggle for something, scramble for something close by that they could write it down on. So we have two sources of material from which the Quran originates. Oral sources, the collective memories of those who tried to memorize Muhammad's recitations as they heard them, and then written sources. When they couldn't memorize everything, they would scramble to write down the rest of what they couldn't remember. So these are the two source materials that we find from which we derive the Quran of today. Now, how did we get from these oral memories and the written materials into the written form we have today? It's a fascinating story. Something happened during Muhammad's early lifetime, actually shortly after the death of Muhammad. But before we get to there, I'm going to put up on the screen here some recitations, or actually some notations from the Hadith literature. These are remarks that Muhammad made. And Muhammad was asked during his lifetime, if I want to know who the expert is on the Quran, who would I go to? Who's your go-to guy, Muhammad, to find out what the Quran says? Who's been with you most of the times during these periods of revelation that has memorized most of the recitations that the angel Gabriel gave you? Who's your expert? So Muhammad was asked who the expert is on the Quran. From Sahih al-Bukhari. I heard the Prophet say, learn the recitation of the Quran from 3 people. Or from 4 people. From Abdullah bin Masud, he started with him. Salim, the freed slave of Abdu Hudhaifa. Muad bin Jabal, and Ubay bin Ka'b. So Muhammad was asked, as recorded in Sahih Bukhari, who the experts are on the Quran. Who's been with you, Muhammad, that knows the Quran by memory? If I want to know what the angel Gabriel has recited to you, who should I go to? These are the guys Muhammad pointed to. Now I've underlined 2 names up here specifically for a specific reason, because they're repeated throughout the Hadith literature. Abdullah bin Masud and Ubay bin Ka'b. So from the Hadith of Sahih Muslim, we find something very similar. Abdullah bin Masud reported, I in fact recited before Allah's Messenger more than 70 chapters of the Quran. Mashruk reported, I heard Allah's Messenger saying, learn the Quran from these 4 persons. Ibn Abd, or Abdullah bin Masud, he started with him, and then Ubay bin Ka'b and Muad bin Jabal. So again, we see 3 names repeated here, but particularly Ibn Masud and Ubay bin Ka'b. So Muhammad, from Muhammad's own mouth, he was asked, who are your experts, Muhammad? Ibn Masud, Ubay bin Ka'b. These are my go-to guys that have been with me almost every time the angel Gabriel has come with me, and they know the Quran by heart. They've memorized it. Now I put another name up here, Zayd ibn Thabit. Zayd bin Thabit. I may say bin Thabit or ibn Thabit. The ibn and bin are interchangeable. It means son of. Zayd bin Thabit, son of Thabit. Muhammad was Muhammad's personal secretary, but he was never recognized by Muhammad as an authority on the Quran. He was never mentioned by name as an expert on the Quran. These other 2 guys were, Ubay bin Ka'b and Abdullah bin Masud. Now why are these names important? Because shortly after Muhammad's death, something happened. In the year 633 AD, Abu Bakr, who was the first caliph after Muhammad's death, was facing a crisis. And in the year 633, an important battle took place in Islamic history called the Battle of Yamama. In the Battle of Yamama, many of the people who had memorized the Quran were killed in battle. You see a problem here. Remember, one of the two major sources for the Quran was the collective memories of those who had memorized it. So what's going on here? These guys go off into battle, they're killed, the Quran disappears with them. So Abu Bakr recognizes right away, I got a problem on my hand. I got a problem on my hand. Now let me read you what is recorded in Abu Dawood's Kitab al-Masih. He narrates this particular issue. He says, we've heard that many Quran passages were revealed, but that those who had memorized them fell in the Yamama fighting. Those passages had not been written down, and following the deaths of those who knew them, were no longer known. Nor had Abu Bakr, nor Umar, nor Uthman as yet collected the texts of the Quran. Those lost passages were not to be found with anyone after the deaths of those who had memorized them. This, I understand, was one of the considerations which impelled them to pursue the Quran during the reign of Abu Bakr, committing it to sheets for fear that it should perish in further theaters of war, when men who bore much of the Quran, which they would take to their grave with them after their fall, and which after their passing would not be found with any other. So right away we see a problem. These guys had been around Muhammad during his periods of revelation. They're the only ones that had memorized parts of the Quran. They fell in the battle of Yamama, and they took the Quran to their grave with them. Now right away you see a problem. How can Muslims, with this story, and this is in their own literature, this is in their own history, how can they have the gall to say, we have the Quran that was given to Muhammad? They don't. Much of it was lost during the battle of Yamama, the year after Muhammad died. Right away we see a huge problem. So what does Abu Bakr do? He says, I've got a problem on my hand. I need to order somebody to collect the Quran from those remaining who are still alive, who still have it in their memories, and then find it on these other scraps of material that it was written down on. Sticks and stones and animal skins and pieces of bark and so forth. So he orders the commission of the collection of the Quran. He says, I've got to collect it before the rest of it gets lost somehow. So who does he order to collect the Quran? Now you would think if you were in Abu Bakr's sandals, that wouldn't you order this job, wouldn't you give this job to somebody who, maybe by Muhammad's own mouth, was a recognized expert in the Quran? Maybe a couple of these guys that we saw earlier, like Ibn Masud or Ubay ibn Ka'b, who was said by Muhammad, these are the go-to guys who know the Quran. These are my experts. If I was in Abu Bakr's shoes, that's who I would commission to do this job. Is that what Abu Bakr did? No. He orders the collection of the Quran, and he assigns this task to Muhammad's undersecretary, Zayd ibn Thabit. Somebody who was never recognized by Muhammad as an expert on the Quran. So Zayd ibn Thabit does his best. He finds all the people that still have the Quran memorized. He gathers up all this other material that the Quran's written on, and kind of puts it all together in a collected volume, writes it all down, gives it to one of Muhammad's widows, a gentleman or a lady named by the name of Hafsa, who was Abu Bakr's daughter, Muhammad's widow. She tucks it under her bed as it was, and there it sits for about 20 years. Now, fast forward about 20 years later, during the reign of Caliph Uthman, the third caliph after Muhammad's death. We're talking about 650, 652 time frame now. Muhammad died in 632, so about 20 years after the death of Muhammad, Caliph Uthman has a problem on his. Oh, yeah, I like this. Let me back up. This is what Zayd ibn Thabit, these are his remarks when he was ordered to collect the Quran. Notice what he says. He says, how can you do something which Allah